Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so this video, I'd like to be a follow-up to the first video I did about Brianna Joy Gray. Okay, and I do feel kind of bad about it because I don't like pointing fingers at specific people. I don't enjoy it. However, and also I think Brianna Joy Gray, she looks like a very nice person, probably a lot nicer than I am. She seems like a very smart person, probably smarter than I am. And so I respect her. Okay. And I think she is a nice person, but, in fairness, and I don't think it's a criticism, I don't think it has to be taken as a major put down because I don't think that having narcissistic characteristics or narcissistic issues, I don't think that makes a person bad. Okay. I think a lot of just neutral people, just regular people have narcissistic issues. And maybe that's even part of the maturity experience for young people or even people that are not so young. I mean, a lot of us sometimes would like to be a little less narcissistic in life. And sometimes, sometimes we don't see it in ourselves, or maybe sometimes we sort of notice it in ourselves, but we feel justified. Okay. And I think in the case of Brianna Joy Gray, I think we have a case where I think she feels justified. Okay. I think she feels justified because I don't think, maybe it's unfair for me to say she's just narcissistic. Okay. Because you have to take the context, just like with the Lori Vallow and the Charles Daybell, or what is it? No, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Sorry. The Mormons, the Mormons. Um, I I wonder sometimes if you take the religious element out, okay, I wonder if they would present exactly the same way. Okay, my hunch is I think they would be narcissistic even without the religious element. It would just express itself in a different way. That's my hunch. Because I think Lori Vallow, her family has a lot of outlaw, I don't know, outlaw characteristics. I think that family kind of has sort of an outlaw streak, I guess, a streak, right? So, I hesitate to say that Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell are religious narcissists. I think their narcissism is expressed and I think maybe even exacerbated with their religious loyalty or their religious, whatever, their religious zealotry, I guess, whatever. But in the case of Brianna Joy Gray, I think that probably I'm going to go ahead and just assume that taking away her political loyalties, okay, just kind of putting that on the side, she's probably a pretty nice person. Although I think she is kind of sharp and kind of to business. I think she can act nice, but I think I don't think she oozes with a ton of feeling either. Just to be fair. I mean, I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm just saying she's probably a little bit Machiavellian. And Machiavellian can show up in ways that don't seem so overtly like Darth Vader, right? She doesn't come across as Darth Vader, but I think there is kind of a very, I would say, a barrier and some coldness. And I say this because I'll explain myself. Even though she pretends to be totally on the side of the Palestinians, okay, totally, all of her sympathies are on the side of Palestine in this recent war. Basically, it's a flare up basically in Israel right now. Um, I haven't seen her like oozing with like getting caught in her throat and being at the verge of tears talking about the Palestinians. I haven't seen that. I just see her getting upset and using the Palestinians as sort of like proof of her philosophy. And it's just an ideology, basically, the idea that people ought to have the freedom, the legal right to armed violent resistance, And so I see more of the anger and I see more of the outrage, but I don't see the catching in the throat, getting stuck in the chest, being bowled over by the deaths of so many thousands of people. And then, frankly, I think this kind of glib indifference to death, I've seen it even in the COVID epidemic. We can argue, but I mean, however we want to play the games with the cause. In the course of the COVID pandemic, more than 10 million people lost their lives. Or I would say it's probably more than that. Whether we can parse it, well, some people had heart disease anyway, and COVID would, they if they didn't have the heart disease, the COVID wouldn't kill them. Okay, but you know what? Putting all the little tedious little arguments aside, more than 10 million dead people were left in the wake of COVID. And I see people bickering about all the things. Oh, they're going to take away my right to free speech, or they're going to restrict my freedom. Okay, I get it. I'm also concerned about freedom too. But it's like in all the chattering and arguing about, COVID, I haven't heard people just get punched in the stomach of 10 million people being dead. It's like a stomach punch. And sometimes I wonder if maybe recently, with just this onslaught of just all these like opiate overdoses, and just we don't even bother counting the number of people who get killed in roadway accidents in the United States. I mean, that's like 40,000, right? I mean, hey, if I'm wrong, it's like 30 to 40,000. But I mean, every year, imagine what it's like to die in a roadway accident in the United States, getting crushed, in an auto collision, and having internal bleeding, and dying in pain. I mean, I'd rather get shot by a firing squad, right? Because at least a firing squad would kill you in just a couple of seconds. I mean, so you're not going to really feel that much. But getting in a head-on collision or whatever, dying in the roadways. I mean, that's like, that would be torture. I mean, you couldn't legally execute people like that, but people have to die in torture, being killed in the roadway. So what I'm saying is, we have like massive death going on all around us. I mean, on the scale of, let's say 90 to 100,000 opiate overdoses, or drug overdoses, and then like 40,000 people dead in roadway accidents, suicides. I mean, just you add up all these things, and I wonder if maybe we all maybe have become sort of desensitized to mass death. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to blame, I'm not going to put all this on Briahna Joy Gray, just herself. I think it's also the climate. I think we're becoming almost desensitized to mass scale death situations where people are actually dying. But I still take note. I still take note because, frankly, even a lot of the Palestinians I see, I don't see them so much suffering the sadness of people dying as much as I see them in the outrage of people dying. Okay, so I notice these things. And so I notice that Briahna Joy Gray is more in the outrage. Okay, and I put that more in the Machiavellian spectrum, right? I mean, the sadness, just being punched in the stomach. I mean, that's just more just the, not the undefended. But I think this is telling. Just because I think that whatever political loyalty Briahna Joy Gray has, okay, I think that loyalty is going to reflect a little bit her temperament. Okay, and so I think there are ways that you can be associated even with the left wing, with liberal stuff, with all this stuff about the underdogs, whoever the underdog is, the right to armed resistance, to violent resistance, because you're an oppressed people, and trying to frame people to look like they're, vulnerable, and they're basically being taken advantage of by a stronger power. Okay, I understand. And there may be there's going to be some truth to that. Okay, there's always some truth to everything, right? But the idea that she hangs her hat more on insisting, she's not going to let go of the grip on this, just insisting to the bitter end that they ought to have like this legal right to resist. This is like an international law principle, and that the right to resistance includes violent resistance, right? And so this is where I want to talk about, how I see the narcissism, and maybe unlike the Lori Vallow and the Chad Daybell, maybe it's not that Briahna Joy Gray is a totally narcissistic person who just shows her narcissism maybe in her political zealotry, her zealousness. Maybe she actually is maybe kind of a Machiavellian person in her real life. I assume she is pretty much competitive and very much out for herself, whatever. I assume that. I don't assume that she's really truly a teddy bear. I mean, let's be real about that. But I'm going to assume that her narcissism is to some extent ideological. Okay, and that somehow she's so caught up in this ideology, and apparently her ideology is not just left wing, but it's the ideology of revolutionary politics, where these are people who believe that in the end, oppressed people do not get anywhere through congeniality and trying to get along, and that you have to basically, you actually, real changes don't get made for oppressed people without the right for violent resistance, and that is the way things get improved. That's basically the worldview she has. I'm simplifying and summarizing, but if you look at the repeated incidents she's had with Robbie on the Hill with their little arguments, and also a recent interview that BRIAHNA Joy Gray had on her own YouTube channel with Cornel West. Okay. And basically, you can see the difference because Cornel West has pretty much the same philosophies that BRIAHNA Joy Gray has, but it doesn't make him narcissistic. And what do I mean by that? Okay. I mean, you can watch the interview yourself and you can see both Cornel West and BRIAHNA Joy Gray pretty much come from the same neighborhood in terms of politics, right? Their philosophies are kind of in the same neighborhood. But you'll notice that Cornel West is so different, even though they have the same politics. And so one of them, I think, is more narcissistic. In other words, I think sometimes maybe political ideas are maybe too powerful for a person's personality. Okay, and you get so taken by a political loyalty that it actually can compromise your personality. You know what I mean? So that would be, to me, kind of like there's religious narcissism. I think there can also be political narcissism. Okay, so what is narcissism? I want to try to define narcissism a little more deeper than just the symptoms that we all understand. All of us kind of know a narcissistic person when we see him, all right? But what is a deeper way to define why a person is so arrogant or so insensitive to others or so engrossed in their own self-concerns, okay? Basically, one way to look at narcissism is having a neurological challenge, having a neurological difficulty in holding the dissonance between things as they are and things as you would like them to be. Okay, like the ideal versus the real. The ideal versus the real. Okay, there's always going to be some, how things really are, the cold reality of how things are versus how we would like them to be or how we think ideally things should be. Okay, being so attached to the ideal of how things should be. Okay, and that is the world of politics, right? The world of politics is how the world should be as opposed to how the world is. Okay, and so when people have maybe a tendency towards narcissism, okay, and they get involved in politics, which is inherently about the world as it should be as opposed to how it is, right? Okay, if you already have a narcissistic tendency, politics is going to suck you up and it's going to kind of take over the narcissistic part of you, or the narcissistic part of you is going to get really attached to the political thing, and you might lose what little connection you had to the world as it is. Okay, and so in a sense, when you get involved in politics, I think there should almost be like a qualifier test whether a person should even get into politics. Like to qualify for politics, you need to demonstrate that you're not going to get too messed up with. And it's almost like taking a drug. Some people should smoke marijuana. Some people should stay away from marijuana. You know what I'm saying? If you're too fragile, the politics is going to suck you up, and it's going to sort of hijack the narcissistic part of you, and you're going to lose touch with the real world, the world as it really is. Okay, and so I think politics is kind of like pornography is not for everybody. Some people can watch pornography; it doesn't do anything to them. They don't even think that's even that attractive. I think there are some people, they look at pornography and it's like, God, that's sad. It's just, they don't get turned on because they can see the bigger picture. But other people with pornography, it like overtakes their brain. Okay. And so we're not all created equal. Okay. And for some of us, the politics is too much for our own narcissistic weaknesses, right? Everybody has a narcissistic weakness where under the right conditions, we're going to fall into and collapse into and get absorbed in maybe too much concern about how the world should be as opposed to how the world is. Okay. And I think that tension is really kind of the essence of narcissism, that some brains can handle that tension better and they don't get confused in that dissonance between how things should be versus how things really are. And obviously, when you see the classic narcissist, it applies to the self, how I really am versus how I wish I were. It's basically, but it's the same dynamic, right? Okay, so basically, I think that if you look at the conversation between BRIAHNA Joy Gray and Cornel West, Cornel West agrees that people ought to have the right to violent resistance, right? He agrees that ought to be like a universal principle, right? But he was careful to say, but let's not get carried away with it, because basically, if you just hold on to the fact that you have the right to a violent resistance, if you're an underdog person, that doesn't mean it's always wise to do violence, right? And it also doesn't mean that you ought to just commit any old violence, like killing children or killing basically innocent civilians, And BRIAHNA admitted that she couldn't let herself fully endorse the idea. She couldn't allow herself to fully endorse the idea that we ought to put like caveats on the right to violent resistance, that she wants to preserve this kind of like, it's like an emotional thing for BRIAHNA. She admitted that she wants to sort of preserve this attachment, that we ought not to put too many qualifications on an underdog's right to have violent resistance. So it's like she has a lot of difficulty kind of letting go of that idea that, violence is sort of like this weird attachment she has. And it sort of prevents her from being, let's say, more agreeable and maybe more neutral in conversations. And I think it also distorts her view of the Palestinians, okay? Because, the Palestinians as a people, it's hard to describe a whole people because there's millions of Palestinians, right? And obviously there's going to be some Palestinians who don't want any part of any fighting. They're not zealous. They don't want to own the entire territory. They've already accepted that, Israel is there to stay, and they're going to have to find a way to get along. But that's probably a minority of Palestinians, or it's a demographic of Palestinians who are probably not represented by the prevailing leadership. Okay, the prevailing leadership in Palestine is very hostile to Israel. Okay, and let's just be honest about that. So when we talk about the Palestinians, unfortunately, they are represented. Just like there are Jewish people who are not really represented by Benjamin Netanyahu, but that's not the effective majority. Okay, the effective majority of Israelis are represented, whether you like it or not, by a very aggressive and very kind of a hostile leadership, like what we see with Benjamin Netanyahu and other sort of right-wing Israelis. So whether we like it or not, how would you say, like, I can understand there are some Palestinians that don't really want any part of the fighting. They just want peaceful solution. And there's probably Jewish people that just want peaceful solution. They don't want to escalate. But the bottom line is that the Jews and the Palestinians are represented by pretty combative and pretty hostile leadership. Okay. And so what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that in the end, okay, Palestinians, they may be oppressed. It may be that Israel is dominating them, and it may be that Israel is stronger than the Palestinians. Okay, but here's the thing. It's not like Palestinians are this, how would you say, they're not like this passive group that's just passive. They're not just passive and just being dominated. They're being dominated in the context that both of them are at war with each other. Okay, the Palestinians have been fighting the Israelis since more than 100 years. Okay, more than 100 years, the Palestinians have been fighting the Jews. Okay, and a big part of their leadership openly does not want Israel to exist. Okay, now even I try to be neutral. Okay, and I don't have any special attachment to Israel. I don't believe in that. But even I can say that realistically, okay, trying to distinguish between the politics of how you want the world to be versus the realism, just the realism. Okay, letting go my own ideologies, letting go my own idealism. Okay, I can understand that there may be debates about whether Israel was right to come into Palestine and just a sneaky. They had a sneaky way of buying land and kind of taking over and sort of inserting themselves into Palestine without maybe really working first on getting the consent of the Palestinian people, right? And that's a real issue, right? Okay, and so I am okay in the abstract, okay, having an argument about whether the existence of Israel as it is politically, if that's legitimate. Okay, I can argue about that, and I can entertain questions about that. Just like I can entertain questions about the legitimacy of the British people taking over North America, and just basically taking it away from the native people. I mean, it's not a realistic way to go. I mean, obviously, very quickly we just have to accept the realism that Europe basically conquered the Americas. I mean, that's just realistic. I mean, but we can still have the abstract conversation about the legitimacy, right? So I understand that. But the thing is that in the end, even though I may have questions about the legitimacy of Israel, okay, realistically, taking aside my own narcissistic, attachment to the ideal, how things should be, okay, I have to admit that realistically, Israel is there, okay, and they're pretty well established, all right. And over the decades, as they fought war after war with the Palestinians, and it has been war, and believe me, the Palestinians are not pacifists. They have been aggressively and with hatred and total dislike for Jewish people. So it's not like they've just been. It's not like, oh, we love you, but we're going to fight you. It's not even. I don't even think it's comparable to the Russians versus the Ukrainians, because the Russians feel like Ukraine is part of them, right? In this case, I think for Jewish people, I think Palestinians are basically just like, in some cases, I think they see them as subhuman. Okay. And so the level of hatred and the level of dislike, all right, and this active warfare, and likewise the Palestinians, they can't say, oh, I would love to love the Jews, but no, they hate the Jews, okay. And so they're not just fighting out of necessity, they're fighting out of hatred, okay. So the Palestinians have been fighting, and this has been a war, okay. And over the decades, Israel has been getting the advantage because they've been winning the war. That's what happens when you fight a war, okay. So on the one hand, I can question whether the foundations of Israeli history are actually legitimate. I can question that. But on the other hand, I have to be realistic and say, well, they're established. They're there, and it's too late in the game to have a realistic questioning of their right to exist, because it's just too well established. So you have to switch gears, okay? And you have to now go, okay, now that they're there, now how do we deal with this situation, and just be more realistic. And then secondly, to look at Palestinians as just being, a vulnerable, oppressed people, okay? Well, unfortunately for those poor Palestinians who are vulnerable, okay, they have been represented by a leadership that puts them in a very bad position. So you can't just point the finger at Israel for let's say winning the war. You also have to equally point the finger that unfortunately Palestinians have a terrible leadership that puts them, those whatever number of truly innocent Palestinians who really don't want any warfare, who don't want to have any bad blood with the Jews, who may not even dislike the Jews. I don't know, whatever percentage that is. Let's call them the peaceful Palestinians, okay? Well, they're represented by leadership that puts them in a bad position, and I'm sorry to say, puts them in danger, okay? So I'm sorry, you cannot say that Israel is solely responsible for, injuring innocent people. It's complicated. There is also the fact that the Palestinian leadership has put the innocent people, put their own vulnerable people in a position to be hurt. Okay. And of course, Israel, you could argue whether they maybe escalate too much, whether they use dirty tricks, whether they don't play they play a little dirty, but Hamas plays dirty too. They go into these tunnels, they conceal themselves in places where they know that civilians would get killed. So, I mean, it's just bad blood on both sides. And anyway, so the bottom line is, I guess this idea that, well, underdog, oppressed people always have to have the right to a violent resistance. Okay, well, in this case, I think it's more realistic to see the Palestinians as combatants. They are enemies of Israel. Okay, and it doesn't matter if you have a few pockets of Palestinians who are not in their hearts enemies of Israel. The leadership has taken over. And the leadership representing the Palestinian people has put itself as an enemy to Israel. Okay. And so it is really just warfare. I don't think it's fair to say it's just oppression. Okay. And you say, well, but now they're effectively apartheid, because they've separated the West Bank and Gaza. Okay. But that's the result of warfare, not the result of pure politics. Okay. So in that sense, I think to call it apartheid is to ignore the fact that it comes from a context of warfare. Okay. And so I don't, that's where it stops being comparable to the South Africa, because I don't think that situation in South Africa was an ongoing warfare between blacks and whites. I think it was just whites dominating blacks. Okay. In this case, to say that it's just Jews dominating Palestinians, you're taking away and you're not looking at the additional context, which is that Palestine has willingly and zealously tried to be a combatant against Israel going back decades and decades. And also, even if you could argue that Palestinians, let's say they're the vulnerable, they're the underdog, they're the weaker, and that there are sometimes there are atrocities where Israel is maybe too easy on the trigger, killing young people that are just throwing rocks or something like that. Yeah, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Okay, it does happen. Okay, but the bottom line is that in this particular stalemate, because it's like a stalemate, okay, even though you might say in the abstract, okay, like BRIAHNA Joy Gray says, in the abstract, people ought to have the right to violent resistance if they are the oppressed. Okay, that's an abstract idea. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's always wise. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's always productive. Okay, because in this case, if Palestinians just eternally just keep resisting violently against Israel, just because they are sort of in such a dominated position, because they're losing the war, all they're going to do is extend the war and keep losing more. You know what I mean? So just because you have some abstract right that professors and the UN and it exists in some international law, just because you have technically some international legal right to have violent resistance, that's abstract. It doesn't mean that it's always wise. It does not mean that it's always wise, and it doesn't mean that it's always productive. And that's where I see BRIAHNA maybe so attached to this idea that I got to have the violent resistance, got to have violent resistance. She's so holding on to that, that like a narcissist who's so clouded with this particular ideological, this particular ideal way of solving problems. Okay, she, like a narcissist, she's so consumed in that, she doesn't see realistically how, even though you have potentially the international right to do something, okay, by some international law, that doesn't mean that other options are not potentially wiser. Okay. And so I wish she would have more flexibility. And that's exactly the difference that I saw with Cornel West in the interview on BRIAHNA's channel. That Cornel West, he also understands those principles. He also believes in the right to resistance and all that. But he also understands that it's not always wise just because you have that right. And it also doesn't mean you can just do any killing of anybody and just randomly massacring innocent people and somehow that's protected. So obviously Cornel West has just, I think, a little less narcissistic sort of, he's a little less captured into the black hole of that particular, political ideology. And he's still able to see the bigger panorama that, at least in the case of Israel and Palestine, Palestine, they're losing the war. Okay. And they've been losing the war. So why do they keep fighting a war that they're losing? There is a wisdom sometimes to accepting a loss in a war and not assuming that's the end of your existence. Okay. Sometimes the best way out, like in a lawsuit, is to accept, okay, I lost. And so I'm going to settle this case. I'm going to accept that I lost. I'm going to sign a treaty. And now we're going to move into a new chapter. Okay. And we're going to end this phase of the fighting and we're going to move into a new chapter. We're going to maybe eat crap, maybe accept a very bad deal, but we're going to make the best of it because we want peace. And I think that's exactly the kind of attitude and exactly the kind of outlook that I think BRIAHNA Joy Gray finds to be disgusting. This idea that, you can't fight forever and just fight forever because you're underdog. Well, you have to be realistic. Realistically, the Palestinians have chosen to engage in warfare with the Israelis. The Israelis may be in the wrong. If you go back all the way in the history, maybe Israelis have unjustly inserted themselves in Palestine. Okay, that's fine. But the bottom line is that the Palestinians have chosen to go to war over it and chosen to make it a war, and sometimes you lose a war, and they've been losing the war for a long time now. And when people don't know how to lose, what they end up doing is they end up hurting themselves. Sometimes you got to know when you've lost. And so I think in that sense, I think BRIAHNA Joy Gray is looking at things too much through the ideology of her like revolutionary, violent resistance politics. Okay. And because of that narcissism being so involved in that, she's not able to see the bigger picture of what might be a wiser outcome. So anyway, that's just my point of view. And thanks for watching. Thanks.